So neurodiversity was a term first identified by Judith Singer in the 1990s. She used the term neurodiversity to describe the whole of humanity, but the neurodiversity movement is more of a political movement for people who want their human rights. So she decided that it was more of a political move, and she needed a term that was going to work well for her. And people think differently, people process information differently, but she said that there's a lot of discrimination against people that do think differently, and therefore she decided, I'm going to term neurodiversity and create a movement to fight for the rights of these people. When we think about a neurotypical brain, you get a neurotypical and a neurodiverse brain. So the neurotypical refers to the standard brain function, the standard behaviors, the standard processing that's considered normal. These children or adults have met their developmental milestones on time. But when we think about neurodivergence, sometimes there's a different developmental trajectory. So they may not meet their speaking developmental milestones on time. They may take a bit longer to speak. They may take a bit longer to meet their academic requirements. The neurobiology of the brain is also differently wired. They say these children, you know, they beat to a different drum. These difficulties are usually present since birth. There's a different brain anatomy and a different brain evolution. So there's connections in neurological pruning in the brain that's very technical, but it's basically the way the little neurons work in the brain and the way they operate. Those are a little bit more different. There's also a theory of chemical imbalances within the brain. Neurodivergence is also a lifelong condition. It's something you're born with and it doesn't go away, but you just learn to cope with how there's differences. And just to mention that, you know, both neurodivergence and neurotypical do have strengths and differences, but unfortunately our educational systems are largely developed for neurotypical individuals, which makes it difficult for the neurodiverse population to fit in. The types of neurodiversity, the conditions that exist out there. So we're looking at dyscalculia, which is difficulties with numbers, dyslexia, which is difficulties with reading words. Sometimes these children have difficulty identifying B's and D's. They may have difficulties expressing themselves. So dyslexia can happen in various different areas. We've got ADHD, which I'm going to go into in a lot more detail. We've got Tourette syndrome. These are what happens if you have tics, or people will shout out random words or swear words or have tics. We also have your autism spectrum disorder, which is also a communication and different thinking. A lot of people refer to neurodiversity, they think of autism. And we also have what you call developmental coordination disorder or dyspraxia, which then affects the ability to speak properly, coherently, as well as movement. Those children are often quite clumsy, and yes. And as you can see with this incredible image, that all of these conditions come with positive aspects as well. So if you look at something like dyscalculia, these children often have great innovative thinking. They normally have very good verbal skills, although their numerical skills are a little bit more difficult to manage. A child with dyslexia, they have incredible ability to think out of the box and to be very creative about what problem solving. They're great problem solvers. And then we look at our dyspraxia, they also have a great amount of empathy and intuition. So yes, there are difficulties that these individuals face, but at the same time, they also come with gifts. So this is why it is important to work with the person, with the child, with the individual, to support them in where they are good in, and not just work with the struggles and the difficulties that they face. Please stop me if anyone wants to ask a question. Just put up your hand and we can answer questions. So ADHD, you know, what is it? You hear about it a lot. You hear about ADD, but it stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It is a medical condition. It goes back to our neurodevelopmental and neurodiverse conditions. This is the most common childhood condition, and unfortunately, it does affect brain functioning. And if you think about these differences in the brain development and the brain's activity, it affects the child's ability to sit still, maintain attention, self-control, maintaining those emotions, being able to say, I shouldn't get aggressive now. It's difficult for them to maintain. They often have emotional breakdowns, cry a lot. And what's important about ADHD, it doesn't just affect one area of the child's or adult's life, it affects all areas. So social, home, school, work, it affects all the areas of a person's life, and it causes dysfunction in those areas. The core symptoms of ADHD are inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. I'm going to go into a little bit more of those in detail so you understand what ADHD actually looks like. Oops. Okay. This is a very interesting picture that I found. It shows the difference between a normal, which would you call your neurotypical, versus your ADHD brain. And you can see with the ADHD brain is differences in activity. So it shows an underactive side. So the red is more underactive, whereas the rest of the brain is still functioning. So your frontal lobe helps with your planning, your organization, and this is where the underactivity happens. So although the condition is called hyperactivity, it's actually related to an underactive brain. And that's why it's difficult for these children to maintain focus and attention. Okay, I did say that it is the most common, and it's about 5% of children. So if you're looking at a class of 20 children, there's probably one child that is struggling with ADHD. Generally, the population prevalence is around 3 to 5%, and about 60 to 70% of individual symptoms persist into adulthood. There are estimated adult prevalence of around 25 to 43% of children, adults. So often adults learn to cope a lot more with their symptoms, and they've learned to adapt into the more neurotypical environments, and that's why the statistics are a little bit lower. Although it's a lifelong condition, these symptoms they learn to manage these symptoms. I want to just highlight that there are 3 different types of ADHD. Often people think of ADHD, they think of a very hyperactive little boy running around, going under the table, over chairs, running around. But there are actually 3 different types of ADHD. So you get you're definitely your hyperactive, impulsive. Those are the impatient children. They're interrupting others. They're always on the go. They're driven by a motor. It doesn't seem like they have an off button. They have difficulty paying attention, and they fidget quite a lot. Whereas you also get your predominantly inattentive type ADHD, which these tend to be more inwardly focused. They struggle to focus. They are disorganized. They have difficulty following directions, forgetting things. They are very distractible. It's really difficult for them to pay attention. And then you get your combined type, which combines both the symptoms from hyperactive as well as inattentive. Okay, so what causes ADHD? So ADHD, they say that the exact cause of ADHD isn't exactly known, but there are various theories. So they have found that ADHD seems to be hereditary. Hereditary, thank you. Almost 80% of children with ADHD have parents or close relatives with the symptoms. So sometimes they don't realize, the parent says, my child is very busy and stuff, but they seem to act like me. And sometimes the parent needs to actually look at themselves and say, oh, maybe I do have ADHD. And it's actually quite common when we see children, the parents are like, but it's describing me as well. So it does seem to be some running in the family. There's also chemical imbalance in the brain. So you get your certain chemical messages in the brain, the neurons talk to each other, and those are normally what you call your breaks and filters in your brain that ADHD affects. So there's difficulties filtering out information and stopping those impulses and those impulse control. There are also the theory that increases the prevalence of ADHD is the problems during birth and pregnancy, such as if there's low birth weight, there's more likelihood that the child will have ADHD, or if there is alcohol use, nicotine use, low birth weight, exposure to toxins within the uterus as well. What's important to note here is ADHD is not caused by poor parenting, home life, schooling, or diet. It is a biological condition. Often parents bear the brunt of abuse by people by saying, why can't you control your child? Why is your child behaving like this? What are you doing to your child? But meanwhile, the child has a medical condition, and unfortunately, the parents often get blamed for the child's behavior. Now, if we think about ADHD, there are a lot of myths. There's a lot of stigma attached to the condition. And what's important is it's not a new diagnosis. It was first noted in literature in 1798, and it was first termed mental restlessness. The more awareness has come about ADHD, how to identify awareness, and people are saying, no, it's overdiagnosed, but it's not. It's actually, there's improved awareness and increased self-seeking behavior and screenings for ADHD. Unfortunately, many remain undiagnosed or misdiagnosed, and they don't receive optimal treatment because of these myths. These children are often labeled as lazy, stupid, and need to try harder. Important, ADHD is not caused by too much sugar. Sugar can aggravate the symptoms of ADHD. And even a neurotypical adult or child that eats a lot of sugar is going to be more hyperactive, and they're going to have crashes, and they're going to feel tired after eating too much sugar and struggle to concentrate. It's definitely not caused by poor parenting. It's not something you outgrow. It's a lifelong condition. It is not curable, but it is treatable and manageable. And these are just little quotes that children have picked up. I should try harder. Maybe I'm just lazy. I'm just as lostkop as my dad. I need to be stricter. Boys will be boys. So those are the types of myths and ideas surrounding ADHD, which are not always true. Okay. So if we're looking at our core symptoms again, I'm just going to go through them in a little bit more detail. So your inattention. Good way to describe inattention is like driving in the rain with faulty windscreen wipers. There are moments of clarity along with lots of blur. So when a child is struggling with inattention, there will be moments that they see things clearly, and then at other times it will just be blur, and they will struggle significantly to focus. They get easily distracted. They miss details. They forget things. These are the children that arrive to work or to school or to sporting events. Their shoes are left behind. Their books aren't complete. They struggle to maintain focus on one task. So if you give them more than one task, it's very difficult for them to focus on that. They get distracted by something else and then move on to the next task and don't complete the previous task. They also, unfortunately, become bored with the task only after a few minutes. They struggle to also learn new things because it takes a lot of mental effort to learn new things. They have difficulty completing or turning in homework assignments. So these children often don't complete their work in the class. They run out of time and they come to school the next day with incomplete work. They don't finish the task that you give them. They also don't seem to listen when spoken to, so you'll call their name and it doesn't seem like they're responding to their name. You have to keep calling them. You're like, is there something wrong with the child's hearing? There may be, but there may not be, and the child is just in their own head, they're zoning out. These children also seem to be daydreamers. They become easily confused. They move slowly. Sometimes you just want to speed these children up. They seem to just be very slow at completing things and doing things. And they have difficulty processing information quickly, and they struggle to follow instructions, especially if it's a long, complicated instruction. They respond more to quicker, brief, shorter instructions. Hyperactivity. These children are more of your fidgety. They squirm a lot in their seats. These are your children that you can see they have ADHD. They're walking around, they're talking non-stop. They are driven by motors. They touch and play with everything in sight. If they see something, they'll run to it, and they just don't seem to stop. They have trouble sitting still. They will get up and move around. When you tell them to sit still, they will get up. And it's almost like they can't control themselves, so they have to feel like they need to move. They also have difficulty doing things quietly. These children will often talk themselves through activities. They will perhaps even just make sure they're having conversation with someone else while doing things. It's very difficult for them to do something quietly and still. Impulsivity. These are your children that are very impatient. They blurt out inappropriate comments. They don't have those brakes, as the little picture says, like a Ferrari with bicycle brakes, because the brain is going so fast and working so fast. It's so difficult for them to break what they're saying and what they're doing, because they almost have, with ADHD, they have like bicycle brakes. The brakes aren't strong enough for the speed of that brain. They also show emotions without restraint, so it's very difficult for them to, when they feel like crying, when they feel frustrated, it's very difficult for them to contain those emotions. And these are your children that usually have outbursts. They have crying fits, they yell, they scream, they hit their peers because they can't control those impulses. They often act without regard for the consequences because they're impulsive. They do things without thinking them through. It's just difficult for them to control that. And they also have, these are your children that are often it's difficult for them to wait their turn. They will push in line. They always want to go first. What's also important to note is you often think about ADHD and you think about a little boy running around, but there are differences in both boys and girls and the way their symptoms are displayed in girls and boys. So if you look at your boys, they normally have your external symptoms. They impulsive, they act out, they're running around, they're jumping over things. They also struggle. You can see they're inattentive, they're not focusing. You have to keep calling them to refocus their attention. They also tend to be more physically aggressive. Whereas when you look at girls, they tend to internalize their symptoms a lot more. The girls are often more withdrawn. They seem to have low self-esteem. They experience anxiety because they're holding all of that stuff inside them. They're more inattentive and they tend to be daydreamers. And they act out more by verbal aggression, so teasing and more name calling than being physically aggressive. And sometimes it's very difficult to pick out the girls that are struggling with ADHD because they seem to be the quiet, shy, and possibly even good child in the classroom because they're not interrupting and interfering with the classroom. But inside this little girl, they might really be struggling to keep up to date and manage what's happening inside their head within the classroom environment as well, and home and school and everywhere. So it can be very difficult for these little girls to manage.
And I get all grumpy and negative. And when I have a good day, then I get all positive and happy.
What do you want other kids like your age to know that don't have ADHD? What do you want them to know about the kids that do have ADHD?
That they are better at listening than them, and that they could help him.
How can they help?
By telling them that whatever you do, it's still right if you try your best.
I'm just going to stop it there. Okay, so as you can see, that this little girl is really, really struggling. You can see her self-esteem is already being affected. She doesn't even think she's pretty all the time, and she's that little comment says, "I'll be bad." So it's heartbreaking that she's already getting a lot of negative comments, that she feels like she is bad, not realizing that she actually has a condition. And this is why it's so important to spread awareness about what ADHD is, because I think by the age of 10, children with ADHD receive about 20,000 negative comments towards their behavior and who they are. And this is why they develop such low self-esteem. And it's difficult for them to then control things, because they just get into the cycle of, I'm bad anyway, so I might as well just be bad, type of thing. Does it feel like to have ADHD? So it is a busy mind. All the thoughts are happening all at once. And all of these thoughts are of equal importance. It's difficult to filter out the thoughts that is the most important. And people think ADHD is just trouble focusing and fidgeting and being busy, but there is so much more underlying what ADHD is. This is also when you bring into the neurodiversity. There is a lot here that covers all of the neurodiverse diagnosis or conditions. And it's all integrated and all interconnected. And I think one of the most important things that stand out for me is people with ADHD also, they really struggle with time blindness. So when they're getting ready in the mornings, it's difficult for them to say, it's going to take me a half an hour to do something. A half an hour will go by and they think it's 5 minutes, and then the spin is on to try get ready for school. And they haven't realized that they've lost all of their time. Same thing happens when they're writing tests and exams. They think they have so much more time than they actually do. And that's when panic sets in and they don't complete their work. They don't complete tests and exams. They also have difficulty with what you call executive dysfunction. So this front part of your brain is where your executive functioning sits, and it's almost like your brain's management system. So it's the processes in your brain that helps you plan, organize, and manage your environment. So it's basically the manager in charge of an organization that says you need to do that on this time and this day. But that executive function within an ADHD brain is often not working as it should in terms of the neurotypical way. It's also difficult for them to, they also have very difficulties with sensory integration. So often these children with ADHD have difficulties with loud noises, bright lights, smells. They're very sensitive towards sensory information. Children with ADHD also struggle with regulating their emotions. They forget their thoughts very quickly after they've been thinking about something. They'll get an idea and they will just forget it. They also have difficulties with sleeping and eating and going to the bathroom. Often children, adults, they will sit there for hours and realize, I actually need to eat something. And then they will binge eat. Unfortunately, that sometimes does happen, because then they realize they're so hungry that they haven't eaten for hours. Or they will hold in their toilet breaks, and especially with children, it's often then they end up wetting the bed or wetting themselves at school. So those are just the types of things. I'm not going to go into all of them, but that's just a nice overview of what actually happens. When you think of ADHD, yes, unfortunately it does come with impairments if it's not treated and not managed and identified, and this often results in school failure or underachievement at school. These children have potential, but they unfortunately don't meet that potential. They're also prone to injuries, so those are the kids that will impulsively climb up trees, fall out, get on their bicycle, go over ramps where they shouldn't be going and fall down. They often end up in hospital with broken bones because of that impulsivity. As adults, they often end up in car accidents, very high incidence with ADHD and car accidents. Unfortunately, drug experimentation is one of these impairments, often to self-medicate the brain and the difficulties that they experience. they often experiment with drugs to try to calm them down. And it's also difficult for them to manage the peer pressure involved in drug experimentation. Often they develop comorbid conditions such as anxiety, depression, conduct disorder, oppositional defiance disorder. This is more of your behavior that is more malicious, and the behavior that ends these children or teenagers and adults in prison. Impulsivity and carelessness, a life of repetitive failure. All too common. People with ADHD will say that I just feel like I can't get anything right. I fail at everything. And it just ends up as a life of repetitive failure. They also have poor social interactions and relationship difficulties. So they may have difficulties keeping relationships, maintaining relationships. They get bored easily in relationships. Also, sometimes they're prone to more interpersonal partner violence as well. So unfortunately, that may come into play. When trying to get to diagnosis, you need to get information from both parents and teacher. And if these symptoms need to be present for more than 6 months and across the lifespan. So if a child or teenager or someone is just experiencing symptoms for the past 3 months, maybe something has happened. Maybe that's why they're having difficulties concentrating. Maybe that's why they're acting out. Something maybe significant happened. So when we're thinking about ADHD or neurodiversity, we have to think about that's a lifelong condition. So these symptoms need to be persistent. These symptoms need to reduce the quality of social and school functioning. So we can only call it a disorder if it's a disorder, if I can put it that way. The symptoms are not explained by other medical conditions. So there may be things that look like ADHD, but perhaps it's more of a medical condition, or it is a learning disorder, or maybe it's something else, anxiety, depression. If we identify all of these things, then we need to take the child to the clinic or a doctor or a psychiatrist if they have medical aid, but otherwise the first point of contact is a local clinic. When you're talking about comorbid conditions, unfortunately, around 50% of children with ADHD also, I think it's even more than 50%, struggle with poor self-esteem, learning difficulties, so they miss out on those foundation skills at school. They also struggle with anxiety because things are so overwhelming and they sometimes feel so out of control. Their anxiety develops depression. All of those negative comments, all of the challenges, all of the failure result in depression. Substance abuse disorders to self-medicate, and also behavioral problems, which is unfortunately what gets these children into trouble. Is, you know, you have this neurodiversity, everyone's unique, they've got challenges, they've got strengths, and it's okay to be different, and it's okay to be accepted and respected because of your differences. And people can overcome these challenges with suitable accommodations and letting go of those neurotypical standards, because in our education system or in society in general, we are run by a neurotypical way of being. It's a structured life. It's doing a very linear way of being and thinking and operating. And I think it's just about being able to adapt even classrooms and workplaces in order to help people to cope with their difficulties and to help them, because someone needs an environment where they don't have to sit at a desk the whole day. Give them opportunity to move around, or perhaps even with planning things, you have to give advance of what's going to happen, what's going to change with kids, with adults, and that really, really helps people with neurodiversity to function in society in general. And I love the last one. It says we're different, not less. So let's be kind to one another. Let's be more understanding of differences and more accepting of differences. And the more we help each other and lean on each other's strengths, we can all work together and create a better society.